There's a divorce story that I heard years ago that I've never forgotten. The father said the straw that broke the camel's back was coming home from work one day and picking up one of his children for a big warm hug, only to be scolded by his wife for putting the child at risk with unhygienic behavior. How could you use unwashed hands to touch someone you loved so much? Apparently, it wasn't the only time that this had happened either. But this last time, tempers flared, and the unhappy couple had to come to terms with the fact that they didn't see eye to eye on enough to make things work, even if just for the sake of their kids. Imagine all the things that could go wrong if you can't get onto the same page about something like a welcome home hug ritual or the importance of washing hands. What if being late means 1 minute to you, but 20 minutes to your spouse? Or what if the ideal meal for the kids means a cheeseburger and fries to you, but to them it's a salad, fresh bread, and tuna? Nobody has time to sit down and hash out the details of everything before doing it, so we all rely on shorthand like a good meal or I'll be a little late, just to try to get through the day. If there's constant misunderstanding about what those things mean, whether that's at work, at home, or with friends, maybe it's time to find people who see things enough like you do that you can actually plan together. Exploring the Analects, Episode 21, Passage 15.40, Parting Ways. Hey folks, this is Elliott Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 21 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering a 7-character phrase about when to avoid collaboration. As always, I'll read the passage in Chinese and English, explain the ideas behind it, and provide some historical context, and then analyze the language found in the passage as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. If this is your first time listening, be sure to subscribe and drop me a hello in the comments. This is my informal interpretation of this episode's passage. Remember, it's not a translation, but I wanted to capture something about the spirit of this passage that sticks with you for the rest of the episode. And here it is. If you don't see eye to eye, maybe it's time to say goodbye. Now I'll read the passage in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by my translation into English. This translation is a generalization of the Ames and Rosemont 1998 rendering. Passage 15.40. 子曰：道不同，不相为谋。 The master said, people with different ways cannot make plans together. While preparing for this episode, I mentioned this passage to a family member. I found it funny that my main source for collected commentaries had just half a page written about this passage, but 8 pages written on another passage of essentially the same length. And I wondered if that meant everyone was so sure about what this one meant. So what does it mean to you? I asked, and I was a little surprised to learn that this is a common idiomatic expression in modern Mandarin. People use it to mean we see things too differently to get along, or slightly more succinctly, let's go our separate ways. That's definitely the crux of it, and it works no matter how you interpret this passage. But historically, it's had 2 different meanings, one that I'll call the failed collaboration reading, and the other that I'll call the perilous deliberation reading. Let's dig into the failed collaboration interpretation first. It goes something like this. If your life goals, methods of working, or core assumptions about the world are fundamentally different from someone else's, you won't be able to effectively collaborate or make plans together. This is an older and less morally charged interpretation of the passage. Some of the earliest evidence for this reading showed up not long after the Analects itself. The Mencius, compiled roughly 150 years later, states how even the sages might take different paths. Van Noorden translates Book 5a, passage 7.7. The actions of sages are different. Some run off, and some come forward. Some flee, and some do not. But they all maintain their integrity. The second interpretation, the one I call perilous deliberation, rephrases the passage in terms of the risk of engaging with someone who is morally corrupt. It goes something like this. People with integrity shouldn't engage with people who lack it. If you're committed to doing what's right, you won't be able to work with someone whose actions or beliefs are unethical, corrupt, or harmful. This was the mainstream interpretation after the Song dynasty, since it was canonized in the work of Zhū Xī, much like the synthesis we learned about in the last episode. Scholars of the 11th and 12th century tried to revitalize Confucianism by tying it to metaphysical concepts like Tian Li, the principles of heaven. So it's not a surprise to find this reading as a product of that era. My take is that both interpretations are reasonable and have practical applications in our everyday lives, so let's dig into them to understand a little bit more about them. First, let's talk about the older interpretation focused on different ways of life, or what above I called the failed collaboration interpretation. I'll be honest that I have a bias toward this interpretation because I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. If I have trouble cooperating with someone, my first instinct isn't to say they're sabotaging the project or they're stonewalling me. I just wonder what it is about their style of communication or collaboration that I'm not understanding, and I try to adapt. I have a multilingual, multicultural family, and I lived abroad for many years, so I'm very familiar with situations where the point just doesn't get across on the first try. That's okay too. We just back things up and try again. But thinking back to the intro to this episode, sometimes things just don't work out, and it becomes obvious that it's time to part ways. Imagine you and a partner open a pizza shop together in Brooklyn. You both love making pizza. It's your heart's desire to make the freshest, tastiest pizza in the world, better than DeFara, and you'll never compromise on the quality of ingredients or process. DOP San Marzano tomatoes that you go inspect in Italy every year, cheese of the same quality, and so forth. You could keep a single shop open your whole life and maybe get a Michelin star. You thought that's what your partner wanted too, but as your reputation grows, he starts talking about expanding. One shop in Brooklyn just isn't good enough. He wants locations in Queens, Manhattan, Jersey City, even Staten Island. Sure, he cares about quality too, but not like you. If it still tastes great, and more shops means serving more people, that's what he wants to do. Who's right in this situation and who's wrong? We really don't know. You're not against making money per se. You just want to do it while following your heart. And your partner isn't being greedy per se. Of course he wants to make money, but his number one goal is to make more great pizza and to build a company that benefits everyone it employs as well as everyone it feeds. But according to this interpretation, it's time for the two of you to part ways. Depending on your business agreement, you might have to set up a new shop and let your reputation for excellence follow you there. Maybe you'll be right next door for all the neighborhood OGs. He'll find some investors and work his way into food courts and strip malls across America, replacing Sbarro and Domino's left and right on his path to building his crusty kingdom. This is basically the argument that I mentioned above from the Mencius. In Book 5, Mencius tries to explain why revered historical figures like Bo Yi, Yi Yin, and Liu Xiahui could all be considered sages if they all held different philosophical positions from one another, and none quite agreed with Confucius. What it comes down to is not their specific way, but the fact that they all maintained their integrity. One of these sages refused to serve a lord who showed even the slightest moral failing, and another was utterly faithful and had no pride that could cause him to falter. It's really not too different from the pizza shop. You won't compromise on your commitment to quality. Your partner won't compromise on his vision of a thriving business. You might both reach pizza sainthood. You'll just be different patron saints. And the same probably goes for the divorced couple. As much as they might walk away from the entanglement, each thinking the other is ridiculous, if not downright malicious, objectively, are big hugs less important than cleanliness and hygiene? Is keeping your loved ones safe and healthy a less legitimate expression of love than big hugs? Probably not, and we could all use a whole lot of both. Enough about failed collaboration. Let's dig into the perilous deliberation interpretation. To recap, this is how I summarized this argument earlier. People with integrity shouldn't engage with people who lack it. If you're committed to doing what's right, you won't be able to work with someone whose actions are unethical, corrupt, or harmful. This reminds me of the scenario from episode 14, Golden Handcuffs and Pearls Before Swine. That was the episode where we discussed passage 7.12, where Confucius said in some circumstances he'd be willing to profit by, quote, holding the whip. Imagine if you got a job offer with a very lucrative salary, but the boss had a reputation for being strange and cruel. You decide to ignore the warning signs and accept the job. You're getting paid and you can finally afford a new car and a new house, so you're paying that mortgage and it's going all right. Then one day, your boss tells you that you've got a new responsibility. Every day, you're required to go kick a puppy. You tell him that that's a terrible idea and you want a different assignment, but he threatens you. Not only will you be fired if you don't agree, you and your family will be exiled, or worse. So now you're between a rock and a hard place. That's the kind of situation you might get into if you let someone whose way differs lay plans for you. Now, if you have a natural proclivity for cruelty and violence, you'll never end up in that dilemma with the strange and cruel boss. You'd probably be just thrilled to follow his instructions, all the while thinking, what a reasonable person he is, and you're both really stand-up guys. But if you've got any scruples at all, it's better to recognize the situation as early as possible and get the heck out. The history of this interpretation is only a few hundred years younger than the interpretation from the Mencius. We can find it in the 1st century BCE text known as the Yan Tie Lun, the Discourses on Salt and Iron. The Discourses documents a series of debates between factions advising the emperor on the economic impact of government monopolies on salt and iron. On one side were Confucian scholars desperately arguing for a humane approach. They saw it as a moral imperative that the government refrain from monopolizing the industries and instead protect the livelihood of the people by allowing them to profit from production and trade of salt and iron. On the other side was the finance-minded imperial minister Zhang Hongyang, a ruthless pragmatist focused entirely on math, profit, and military supply lines. He argued that the government must maintain a monopoly on salt and iron in order to equitably distribute these critical resources across the country and support the frontiers in their defense campaign against outside forces. The comment in the discourses on this debate is as follows. With one who is not versed in morally principled discourse, it is hard to discuss governance. Those whose ways differ do not join in counsel with one another. The key part of this comment we should focus on is this morally principled discourse, which is really one single character in Chinese, lun. That's the same lun in the Chinese title for the Analects, Lun Yu, as well as the lun in the Chinese title for the discourses on salt and iron, Yan Tie Lun. This lun is not just a meandering discussion. It's not a debate without bounds of any kind, where the party resorting to the most cunning rhetorical maneuvers should be declared the winner. It's specifically a type of discourse with a foundation of commonly held moral principles such as ren, human-heartedness, and yi, justifiable action. These were principles the Confucian faction saw as non-negotiable. But for the minister, Zhang Hongyang, not only were they up for debate, he had a completely different set of non-negotiables. So he ran circles around the poor scholars with masterful rhetoric while they tried to discuss governance with someone who was not versed in their so-called morally principled discourse. Now think back to that bad boss example. But suppose for a second you had a mostly good boss. You know, someone you could consider reasonable, even morally principled enough to only occasionally resort to cruelty and normally with the best of intentions. And for whatever reason, he still assigns you the puppy-kicking task. He even gives you a few good reasons for it. Again, like a mostly good boss does. I don't know, maybe he doesn't want you to kick them that hard, just a little bit, because he read online that it makes puppies grow up big and strong. So you gently remonstrate with him, referring him instead to the ASPCA page debunking this myth. And you tell him puppies grow big and strong when they get healthy meals and belly rubs. He's such a reasonable guy. You're really on the same page about most things. He just fell victim to internet misinformation, as we all do from time to time. So he listens to you. Problem solved. Big group hug with puppies on top. Of course, you can't tell that story with the bad boss. He's morally unprincipled, so he's playing with a different deck of cards. His assumptions about what's right and what's wrong don't align with yours at all. You tell him his source isn't as authoritative as the ASPCA, and he says, of course it's right, because he's smart enough to know when something's not true. You mention how puppies grow big and strong, and he tells you to shut up, because his people already gave him giant mean attack dogs that you'd be lucky to never meet. Try to correct someone like that. It's probably not the best move. I don't want you to get the impression that this interpretation is just about well-intentioned but misguided bosses or master debaters. It's also about teachers and collaborators. It's possibly even more dangerous to have a corrupt teacher or collaborator than such a boss or debate opponent, because teachers and collaborators are more likely to influence you. Zhū Xī, the one who canonized this interpretation, was very focused on making sure that orthodox views were promulgated and that heterodox views were recognized only enough to lead people to the right conclusions. You might even say that that's why he was willing to bring Buddhist and Taoist concepts into the Confucian tradition. He wanted to make sure that these powerful and popular ideas still led people to what he considered to be the right conclusions. So, would Zhū Xī say that those guys we mentioned earlier, Bo Yi, Yi Yin, and Liu Xiahui, had dangerous and heterodox ideas just because they didn't fully align with those of Confucius himself? It turns out that he still revered them as sages for their virtues. So he wouldn't say Bo Yi's ideas should be avoided as immoral because he couldn't work for a ruler who had even slight moral failings, but Confucius said it was good to try to improve a ruler who has some flaws. He wouldn't say anything like that at all. His comment on Bo Yi would probably be more along the lines of, we can learn the value of Yi, righteousness, through the example of the sage Bo Yi. His way was the way of the Zhū, the exemplary person, just like that of Confucius. And Confucius was only a greater sage because he walked the middle of the path and recognized when he was falling too far to one side or the other. The point here is that if you're looking for a teacher or collaborator, you don't have to find someone who is perfect in all respects. You don't even need to find someone you always see eye to eye with. As long as their way is one that you recognize as good, as long as that person engages in morally principled discourse with you, that's good enough. It's the same as the principle in 7.21, 三人行，必有我师焉. Among three people, you'll always be able to find one who can teach you. All right, that just about wraps it up for the traditional interpretations of passage 15.40. Now I'll take a minute to talk about how the phrase gets translated into English. I referenced 9 different translations, including 2 new additions to my collection from Anping Chin and Charles Mueller. That one, by the way, is free at acmueller.net, so it's a nice alternative to the leg translation that you can also find for free everywhere. The translations generally fall into the same 2 camps as the traditional interpretations, with 4 translators in the failed collaboration camp and 5 more or less in the perilous deliberation camp. Both groups interpret the first half of the passage, 道不同, in nearly the same way, with allowances given for variations in dao as path, course, way, and so forth. They differ widely in how they interpret the second half of the phrase, first on how the negative 不 is rendered, and second on how the mutual planning concept 相为谋 is rendered. The failed collaboration camp always renders 不 as cannot. For example, in the 1861 translation by James Legge, such people, quote, cannot lay plans for one another. They also all render 相为谋in nearly the same fashion, always focused on collaboration. Both Ames and Rosemont and Charles Mueller land on the exact same phrase for 不相为谋, cannot make plans together. So in summary, the failed collaboration camp is descriptive and not prescriptive. It says what people cannot do instead of what they should not do, and it's focused on collaboration, not consultation or deliberation, explaining that people who have different ways will have trouble cooperating. this means that it lines up almost one for one with the divorce, pizza shop, and Mencius sages with different virtues interpretation. The perilous deliberation camp has a lot more diversity in its renderings of the negative 不, as well as in the mutual planning concept of 相為謀. This means some translations might line up with the pizza shop interpretation, depending on how you read them, but the way I see it, the further these renderings verge toward exhortation and the imperative voice, the closer they come to that moral hazard reading that one should identify and avoid unvirtuous and heterodox teachers. Here are a few examples to show you just what I mean. Peimen ni renders the second half as, quote, cannot consult each other. This is the lightest touch of all for perilous deliberation renderings, not quite telling people how to act, simply saying people who aren't on the same page won't be able to give each other advice. Anping Chin takes a stronger standing, writing that such people will see, quote, no point in seeking advice from one another. It's a judgment. These people will find the exercise pointless, I suppose because it's going to waste their time. Think about the debates in the discourses on salt and iron. It seems pretty likely that those Confucians walked away feeling like they'd spent all this time and energy on debating someone who would never have changed, regardless of how things went. Last up is the Slingerland, and I'm going to read this one in its entirety since it's the strongest of the perilous deliberation renderings by far. He writes, do not take counsel with those who follow a different way. This is an imperative. You should not do it. Now, I don't mean to put words in anyone's mouth, but this rendering lines up very well with the Zhū Xī good versus evil interpretation. Why would you urge someone to stay away from those who follow a different way? Wasting time and energy is one thing, but the risk of falling under the influence of bad role models is another, much more serious situation. It's also a situation we're going to be discussing in the next episode on passage 2.16, which may be interpreted as an admonition against giving consideration to heterodox teachings. But before we get to do that, I'll have the pleasure of wading through a truly massive amount of commentary, at least 10 times the amount that was written on this passage, in order to figure out how to present that one. Now I'll give you some pointers for learning modern Mandarin and classical Chinese based on passage 15.40. Most of this section will be focused on the gotchas you might run into if you've studied a lot of modern Chinese. That especially applies to the last 3 characters of this passage. So, as I mentioned earlier, this entire passage is worth memorizing, even if you've got no interest in learning classical Chinese, because it's used as is idiomatically. Of course, in 2,500 years, its meaning has transformed significantly, so any indication of what Confucius's original intent may have been has long since disappeared. So in modern usage, 道不同, 不相為謀 is simply an idiom used to express the idea that there's little common ground between two people. A friend might say it when advising you that it's pointless to continue arguing with someone. Just like in the Yan Tie Lun, since you don't see eye to eye on the basics, you're never going to convince them, so the exercise is futile. Or you might say it to a business partner, like in the pizza shop example, to let them know the differences between your visions are too great to reconcile. This phrase says a lot. Don't use it casually, but it certainly has its place. Let's break down the characters in this passage, starting with the first three characters, 道不同. Dao, as you're likely well aware, is literally a path, and it's also possibly the metaphor most commonly discussed across all the schools of Chinese philosophy. When used as a metaphor, if it's not kept in the Chinese pinyin as capital D-A-O, Dao, it will often be rendered as way with a capital W. Among the translations I read, it was rendered variously as ways with a capital W, ways with a lowercase w, paths, and courses, that last one being from the oldest translation, the 1861 leg. All renderings were in the plural because the next two characters make it clear that more than one Dao is under consideration. 不同 means different. That's the rendering in almost all translations. 不同 can be used in modern Mandarin, though it's a little more formal than 不一样. For example, you can explain you're different from other students by saying 我跟别的学生不同. And you may encounter the set phrase 与众不同, someone who stands out from the crowd. In terms of translations of this passage that did not go with different, one choice was not the same, and another was separate. Finally, because there's no explicitly stated subject in this passage, you should probably add one in English, unless we plan to use the imperative voice. Translators mostly chose people or those. I went with people with different ways. On to the second part, 不相為謀. We've already covered the range of ways that this 不 can be translated. It's tricky because, as with much classical Chinese, subjects and grammar are implied at best, and at worst, they're completely irrecoverable. So we're only left to speculate as to whether this should be read as do not, cannot, you should not, or something else completely. The translations mostly choose cannot. 相 is a reciprocal adverb that can be read as mutually, together, or one another. If you're learning modern Mandarin, be careful not to read this as a directional marker like to. I did this originally, but looked into when this shift in meaning occurred, and xiang only started to be used that way during the Han Dynasty, so the rendering would be anachronistic. Also, don't get confused by the Slingerland translation. It may appear to translate it in this way, but the way I see it, his rendering reflects the idea that the Analects should be taken as an instructional text. Anyway, the translation most frequently chosen for xiang is together. Last up is this 為謀. This pair of characters should be translated together, since that's how they often appear in text from the Eastern Zhou. The way here turns a noun into a verb, so a plan becomes to plan, or to make plans. 為 has the same function in 為政, where it turns the noun, governance or policy, into the verb, to govern, or the phrase, to make policy. Another aspect of mo that should be taken into account in translation is the fact that it's focused on larger scale political planning, not planning for everyday life or family affairs. So translators often render 為謀 as to take counsel in order to give it that extra political vibe. While it might be tempting to read mo with a somewhat nefarious tone, especially if you connect it to modern terms like 陰謀, to conspire, this would be another anachronistic reading influenced by how the term came to be used by the Warring States thinkers like the legalists. In the context of the Analects, mo should be read as emphasizing discussion of future events, especially the unknowns and contingencies that may arise, and often with a political or institutional tone. So the neutral choice here is to make plans, and the politically oriented choice is to take counsel. Putting these pieces together with their most common renderings among the translations I referenced, the second half of this passage can be translated as cannot make plans together. All right, folks. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to like, follow, and comment anywhere you watch or listen. I'd love to hear from you. Next time, we'll be reading passage 2.16, an 8-character phrase that has so many different interpretations that all I can really say about it before I sit down and do some serious thinking is, it's about extremes, and Confucius was not a fan of extremes. See you there.